I don't know if we've ever seen this before, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, going through history, I think the last time may have been Randy Moss. We'll talk about everything here. Before we get into it, make sure you go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football, and of course, if you play fantasy football, you're going to love flogfantasy.com. Over there on flogfantasy.com, you can find all my 2023 fantasy football rankings. You can get access to all my premium content, join an awesome community, and when you sign up with promo code FLOCK, you are going to get 30% off any subscription, and yours truly will go through and break down your fantasy football team in a podcast. But that should be it. And let's get to who was an elite level wide receiver in Calvin Ridley. Now, you would think that Calvin Ridley is still unquestioned an elite level wide receiver in Jacksonville if you were to look at where he is currently being drafted. I mean, if you're looking at Calvin Ridley in 2023 fantasy football drafts right now, this is a mid-third round selection. Now, keep in mind, going into 2021, Calvin Ridley was a late round 1 pick, early round 2 pick. And there, yes, I was very happy to go through and draft Calvin Ridley. Now, you can assume that maybe we have some bigger red flags going into this next season. But before we get into anything, I do want to just look at a general overview of what you saw from Calvin Ridley the last 3 seasons we had him. Obviously, 2022 with the suspension. Sadly, we are not able to see Calvin Ridley out there in the football field. But previous to that, 2019, wide receiver 18, so he's a mid-wide receiver 2. Really, the only season we can go off of saying that he is a truly elite level option is going to be 2020, where the man was phenomenal. Keep in mind, Julio Jones was still in this same offense, and this is before Julio Jones fell off as well. So when Calvin Ridley goes out there and averages 91 receiving yards per game, 9.5 targets per game, and a target share from a per game perspective of 26%. This is so damn impressive. It's hard to even put it into words with a prime Julio Jones playing alongside next to him. Now, if we were to dive a little bit deeper into this, you have to remember in 2020, Calvin Ridley dealt with injuries. Like if we are going to go through and look at those 2 weeks where Calvin Ridley played fewer than 70% of the snaps, clearly in and out of football games, we can't really count those. If we were to remove those 2 weeks in this season, Calvin Ridley averages over 10 targets a game, and Calvin Ridley averages 101 receiving yards on a per game basis. And that's with Julio Jones, who is still producing in this offense alongside him. Now, 2021, when he's a late round 1 selection, early round 2, he does take a significant step back if you're going to be looking at his raw fantasy output, where the man's the wide receiver 24 from a per game perspective. I mean, he only averages 56 receiving yards per game. But if you're looking at the underlying numbers, they're still pretty impressive, right? Now, yes, the yards per route run, it falls off a cliff. It goes from 2.5, which is a truly elite level mark in 2020, down to 1.4, which is piss poor. But the air yards that Calvin Ridley was able to see on a per game basis were still elevated to a point where Ridley was getting elite level usage in Atlanta. You can also see this with his 10.4 targets per game. I mean, Calvin Ridley was averaging 116 intended air yards on a per game basis. So for 3 seasons in a row, Calvin Ridley from a per game perspective averaged over 100 total air yards per game, averaging 120 during that 3-year stretch. That's elite. That's the who's who of wide receiver. That's top 5 guy. That's Justin Jefferson. That's Jamar Chase. That's exactly what you were looking for. Now, what I wanted to do is try to find an example of a wide receiver that had as big of a fall off that Calvin Ridley saw from 2020 to 2021. So we headed over to RotoViz. We put in Calvin Ridley's 2020 statistics and then searched for wide receivers the following season that fell off as hard as Calvin Ridley. So what we did is since the year 2000, we looked at all wide receivers that were able to average 90 receiving yards on a per game basis. And then we were narrowing down that long list of players to wide receivers that their following season, from after averaging over 91 receiving yards per game, averaged less than 56.3 receiving yards per game. And there were only 2 guys since the year 2000 to do that. You had Brandon Marshall and you had Calvin Ridley. Now, with Brandon Marshall, of course, is a wide receiver that was elite during stretches. With Brandon Marshall, this is a wide receiver that at points, he was obviously a league-winning option. So we have to zero in on exactly when this happened for him. And with Marshall, it occurred from the 2015 season, where he was a New York Jet, to his final season as a New York Jet in 2016. That goes from when he leads the NFL in receiving touchdowns to the following season. He has 3 receiving touchdowns in 15 weeks. So outside of that, we really don't have an example of a wide receiver that went from the highs of Calvin Ridley down to the lows of Calvin Ridley the following season. But maybe we are just nitpicking here. And of course, Calvin Ridley looks like an extreme outlier, right? I mean, with Calvin Ridley here, this is a wide receiver that, misses essentially 2 years of football. So maybe it's not fair to even look at his 2021 season in the first place. And you can see in underdog drafts right now, people don't think it's fair to look at his 2021 season. You're seeing that because he has an ADP of 31.9. You are seeing Calvin Ridley go back-to-back with Breece Hall, back-to-back with Mark Andrews in these drafts, and you are seeing Calvin Ridley go directly ahead of Lamar Jackson, ahead of the running back 1 in his offense in Travis Etienne, and also ahead of Deebo Samuel as well as Amari Cooper. So underdog drafters are telling you, Mason, come on, man, this is just an extreme outlier. Don't be looking at this. He will bounce back. And I do want to look at historical examples of that. But before we do, of course, if you want to get in an underdog draft, you can today with us on the live stream, because it doesn't matter when you're watching this. We are streaming underdog drafts every single day on this channel. Best ball, so no time commitment at all during the season. I drafted over 700 teams on Underdog last year, won $150,000. You better believe we are drafting a lot of underdog teams again this year on the live stream. When you sign up to Underdog with promo code FLOCK, you are going to get a 100% deposit match up to $100. Plus, you're going to get my 2023 fantasy football rankings and a free trial to flockfantasy.com. But I looked up real quick, biggest wide receiver bounce backs through NFL history. We have a list of 3 guys here that maybe, just maybe, we can look at comparable options to Calvin Ridley, because I really wanted to find a wide receiver that went from being the top of the game, then struggled for a 2-year period, and then was right back at the top of the game. And I wanted to see every example we could find through history. So please, if I'm missing someone here, go to the comment section and let me know. I am younger than the vast majority of people watching this. I am an idiot. The bank that I have to be looking back at NFL seasons and truly understand what was happening, probably 2008, 2009, when I started playing fantasy football. Of course, I was a diehard dynasty fantasy football player in 2014. From then, I have a photogenic memory, but before that, it's a little hazy. It's a little gray. So I'm sure there are other people that are much more knowledgeable than I am, and I would love to hear your opinion in the comment section. But the first guy that popped up, Randy Moss. Okay, I think this is going to be the most common example that people are going to. And you saw Randy Moss, early on in Minnesota, right, dominating. You have Moss going out there, 1,300 yards, 1,200, 13, 1,600 total yards. And then he has that stretch in the middle of his career, his final season in Minnesota, and then going over to Oakland when Randy Moss doesn't do anything until his career is resurrected by the combination of Tom Brady and Bill Belichick, where in 2007, he goes out there and has 23 receiving touchdowns. So that's the first example of a bounce back that we can look at. We'll get back to this in a second. Our next one that we are going to be looking at will be Terrell Owens. I don't know how good of an example this is. And this is what popped up. This is from the year 2000, right? Where the prior season in San Francisco, the man only had 53 receiving yards on a per game basis. And this jumped up to 103 receiving yards per game the following season. I don't know if this is a good example, however, because you really only had that dip from Terrell Owens in a single season, and it's not like we had multiple years of inactivity, similar to what you saw with Randy Moss or Calvin Ridley. And then our last guy on this list is going to be Larry Fitzgerald. I also don't know how good of an example this is, right? Because with Larry Fitzgerald, he was just that steady rock essentially throughout his entire NFL career. If you are looking at the man, he played 16 games essentially every single freaking season. But if you are looking at his age 30 year, if you are looking at his age 31 season, those are years where he averages about 50 receiving yards per game. Then it jumps up to 76 receiving yards per game. In reality, I don't know if that's a good example either, because he didn't see that same high that Ridley did at 100 yards per game prior to the suspension/missed seasons. And then when he came back, it's not like he was a league winner either. So really the only example that I can personally find from a player that went from being at the top of the game, a top 3 option, both in real life and fantasy football, to then dip down for one reason or another through a 2-year stretch and then right back to the top of the game, is Randy Moss. Like I said, I really want you to go to the comment section and correct me if I'm wrong here. But in my mind, to chase Calvin Ridley here at this price point in particular, to be aggressively drafting him before Deebo Samuel, aggressively drafting him before Lamar Jackson, Amari Cooper, Travis Etienne, DeAndre Hopkins, Najee Harris, hell, even Christian Watson. I don't get it. I know a lot of people are probably going to hate this take, but specifically because Ridley does look like such an outlier, where in my mind, it's very difficult to see how this plays out. I don't really know what's going to happen. I think I would rather take the wide receiver that looks to be on a more standard trajectory here in terms of possibly turning into a league winner. I would rather go with the guy like Christian Watson, who flashed elite level traits in his rookie season, looking to take that year 2 jump that we've seen from so many wide receivers in the past. I would personally rather take that leap of faith with Christian Watson than bet that Calvin Ridley is some outlier, even if he is in a phenomenal offense in Jacksonville. And if you're looking at Christian Watson in these underdog drafts right now, he's a mid 4th round selection compared to Calvin Ridley being a mid 3rd round selection. That's where I'm going to go. And I will bring up this situation that you have in Jacksonville. And yes, you have an elite level quarterback, right? I think we can assume that Trevor Lawrence is going to support a phenomenal passing offense. But this isn't a scenario where you have Calvin Ridley as the top dog and there are nobody to take targets away from him. No, there are a decent amount of skill positional players here in Jacksonville. Clearly, you still have Christian Kirk. I think Kirk will be the wide receiver 1B to Calvin Ridley's wide receiver 1A this next season. And if it was just Christian Kirk, not a big deal, right? I mean, hell, we saw Calvin Ridley be elite alongside Julio Jones. But where it gets a little concerning is all these additional depth pieces that you have, right? I mean, you have Evan Ingram on this roster who will take targets. You have Zay Jones on this roster who will take targets. The running backs with Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby will take targets as well. So given the depth that you have in Jacksonville, I don't know. There are people way smarter than I am that are strongly advocating for you to go through and take Calvin Ridley in the middle of the 3rd round here. I would love to hear from those people. I would love to hear if there's another example of a player like this that we can look back historically on, or if you are betting for him to either turn into Randy Moss or just be a complete outlier that we've never seen before. But again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Really do appreciate you. As always, go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. If you want to get in a chat with us today on the live stream, you can do so on Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code FLOCK and you'll get a dollar for dollar deposit match up to $100. Plus, you'll get my 2023 fantasy football rankings and a free trial to flockfantasy.com. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you, ladies and gentlemen, and really do hope you have a great day.